Every now and then I'll come across someone who seems to get offended or indignant when they notice some other Catholic referring to the Rosary as a weapon. And we've all met people like this. They tend to be more pacifist in their philosophy, and they tend to treat anything associated with weapons or armed conflict as intrinsically evil. I can think of older relatives, in my own experience for example, who would get indignant about things like toy guns or swords, as if having such items could only teach children to grow up to be like violent by nature. This person, for example, was offended by a comment on Facebook that described the Rosary as a weapon, and another here on Twitter. And then there was an article published in The Atlantic that made the rounds a couple years ago that tried to portray the Rosary as a symbol that violent extremists and reactionaries were flocking to. Here's a screenshot of well-known Jesuit priest Father Thomas Rees apparently endorsing that article on Twitter. So is the Rosary a weapon, or is it wrong or even blasphemous to make that association? I'd say the answer is, if we consult the tradition of the Church, it definitely is a weapon. But also, it kind of depends on what you mean by a weapon. Because a weapon, like a sword or a gun, is not an intrinsically evil thing. It can be used for evil, but it can be used for good. It can be used to rob someone, or it can be used to protect someone who is being robbed. That's why police officers carry guns, and it's why you would most likely call the police for help if someone was infringing upon your safety, because they have the weapons and you're grateful that they do in that moment. The Rosary is a good weapon that can only be used for good. It's not like a talisman that we can petition to inflict harm on our enemies, kind of like a voodoo doll or something like that. When the Church says that the Rosary is a weapon, it primarily means that in spiritual terms, like when we are doing battle against our own sinful nature and those who would tempt us away from God, like demonic personalities. Spiritual battle is not about instigating a campaign or effort of aggression against your neighbor. And this is so obvious to anyone using these metaphors that it should hardly need to be said. But it is a weapon that can be used for protection against your own concupiscence, which is an enemy of your ultimate good, as well as other nefarious influences. And this just can't be understated. The Rosary is an extremely powerful prayer because it arouses all the aspects of the human soul in prayer, and therefore benefiting us and strengthening us through God's grace. It engages the senses with audible prayers and the tactile experience of holding the Rosary. It engages our hearts by stimulating our affections through reflection on the various mysteries. That's why they're categorized according to the passions they excite, either sorrowful, joyful, or awe by the glorious mysteries. It engages the intellect through contemplation, which is the highest use of our minds. It's what our intellect is ultimately made for. It engages our will by orienting it to be quiet and still when we might otherwise be busy and restless. So yes, it's a weapon to be used against spiritual evils, but there's also a rich tradition in the Church of it being employed for the good of even temporal affairs. That's why October 7th is the Feast of the Holy Rosary. That date wasn't just arbitrarily chosen, it commemorates the Battle of Lepanto. For a little background on this, since the time of Muhammad, Islam had been expanding into Christian nations, conquering wherever it could. By the time of the First Crusade, Muslims had already conquered a third of the Christian world. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the now Ottoman Empire was pursuing that expansion even further. They had already conquered Constantinople, which was the seat of Christian culture in the empire. At the height of its power, it was poised to conquer Italy and now the Papal States, which would have been devastating for European political order and culture. So Pope St. Pius V organized an alliance of Christian naval forces to confront the Ottoman fleet, which had already been attacking Christian outposts on Cyprus. As they were sailing east, they were confronted by the Ottoman fleet on October 7th in what became known as the Battle of Lepanto. Knowing that the Christian navy was severely outmatched, the Pope called for all of Europe to pray the Rosary for their victory, which seemingly occurred by miraculous intervention. Whether you believe the Blessed Virgin Mary or God or Jesus himself ensured that victory or not, most can agree this was a turning point in preventing further Ottoman expansion into Europe. And that's how October 7th became the Feast of the Holy Rosary. Now, here's an awkward thing that we have to admit about the Church today. It is dominated by feminine sensibilities. Our liturgies, our catechesis, and especially our parishes tend to be most heavily swayed by the whims of especially older women. This is at least true where I live. It's an atmosphere and a culture that in so many ways tends to turn off young men who want to devote their strength to something meaningful, something greater than themselves, something worthwhile. But secular culture is so inclined to the idolatry of the self that it either discourages that kind of noble masculinity or it misdirects young men by a million different temptations towards the self. And meanwhile, seemingly the church doesn't seem to have anything to attract them. So when we rediscover traditional devotions, the kind that used to inspire the martial spirit of young knights, we shouldn't blame young Catholic men for getting excited about that. It's one of the few things that they can grasp and cling to make Catholicism appealing to their masculine nature. Frankly, this is what the church has done. There are precedents for this. They did this in the Middle Ages. After the fall of the Roman Empire, in the absence of one monolithic authority like Rome, regional warlords became the rulers of countless fiefdoms across the European continent. And because warfare was their trade, they were constantly at war with one another, attacking their neighbors. The church turned its attention to this problem in order to redirect their fighting instincts for aggression towards protecting the weak and the vulnerable rather than attacking them. So the church literally hatched a conspiracy to spread stories and legends like the King Arthur legends and his noble knights who used their might for the good of others rather than for conquering. They also used those legends to establish new codes of honor in the martial culture, which became known as chivalry. Part of those codes was deference towards women, because let's be honest, women tend to be less warlike in their instincts. If a particular earl or let's say a duke wanted to claim new lands for his excessive offspring, for example, his wife might counsel restraint or diplomacy to find a better use of his army. This kind of deference became known as courtly love. It was a devotion to the female temperament as what should inspire the motives of a knight's sword. It's also probably worth noting that this is entirely unprecedented in the history of humanity up until that point. No male-dominated culture, and all cultures have always been male-dominated, would deliberately and voluntarily show deference towards women in this way. Christianity and Christendom were the first to do anything like that. So anyways, that's why describing the rosary as a weapon is such a powerful evangelistic tool for the masculine heart. Men have certain strengths which lend themselves to certain vocations, and they want to employ those strengths for something noble and something good. And martial culture has always either inflamed the masculine heart for good or for evil. And if you can inspire men to think of the rosary as a weapon against their own spiritual, like their proclivities, rather than as a hammer against their neighbor, you're both attracting them by their nature and simultaneously redeeming that nature, rather than merely denouncing it, as too many feminist intelligentsia tend to do. So, for what it's worth, I think it's great to describe the rosary as a weapon, as long as it's placed in the proper context. And I'm not alone in that. Pope Pius XI said the rosary is a powerful weapon to put the demons to flight and to keep oneself from sin. That sounds like a pretty noble weapon to me. He also said, let not even one day pass without saying it, no matter how burdened you may be with many other cares and labors. St. Padre Pio famously said, the rosary is the weapon for these times. St. Alphonsus Liguori said, the rosary is the most powerful weapon to touch the heart of Jesus, our Redeemer, who loves his mother. And lastly, St. Jose Maria Escriva said, the Holy Rosary is a powerful weapon. Use it with confidence, and you'll be amazed at the results. So because October is traditionally the month of the Rosary, I'd invite you to take the opportunity to try it out for yourself to see if it has the potential to transform your life like so many holy saints insist that it does. I think every Catholic should be willing to invest in some good devotional artwork for their homes, and a good crucifix should be at the top of that list. Personally, I've always wanted a large, beautiful crucifix for my home, but honestly, I've always found it really hard to find a good one. I usually find that the style is, it's overly sentimental, or the corpus lacks the masculinity of someone who was an actual laborer in the ancient world. So I was pretty pumped when a distributor of a particular crucifix sent me a free sample. It's called the Turin crucifix because it's based on the Shroud of Turin in order to attain to that accuracy of the most famous, or potentially the most famous, image that we have of Jesus. rises. It's full of all these little details that capture the full story of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. So if in your devotional life you want to contemplate at the foot of the cross and seek the true face of the Lord, as countless saints and mystics and popes have encouraged us to do, then I strongly recommend that you check out this particular item by scanning the QR code on the screen or by checking out the link in the description.